see anyone. Can we turn the lights up just a little bit? Because I really like to see you. Can we turn the lights up just a fraction? So I can see everybody. I want to make sure no one's snoozing in the audience. Thank you. What an incredible room, incredible group of people. It's an honour to be here. Can we have the lights up a little bit more, please? Sorry. When I was a young athlete, I taught myself a skill that would one day save my life. And that was, I learnt to love the hills. 3 things that I learnt from the hills. Firstly, they didn't just make me physically strong, they made me mentally tough. The second thing I learnt from the hills is that nobody else liked them. And for an athlete, that was my edge. And the third thing I learned about the hills is that every time I got over one hill, guess what? There was always another one. But here's the thing, as soon as I accepted that, then I learnt to love them. As a cross-country skier and member of the Australian ski team training for the Winter Olympics, I was on a bike ride with my fellow teammates. We were riding from Sydney to the Blue Mountains, a 6-hour bike ride. It was the perfect autumn day. Sunshine, the smell of eucalypt, and a dream. Life was good. We got to the part of the ride that I loved, and that was the hills, because I loved the hills. And I got up off the seat of my bike and I started pumping my legs. And as I sucked in the cold mountain air, I could feel it burning my lungs. And I looked up to see the sun shining in my face. And then everything went black. Where was I? What was happening? I had been hit by a speeding utility truck with only 10 minutes to go on the bike ride. I was airlifted from the scene of the accident by the rescue helicopter to a large spinal unit in Sydney. I had extensive and life-threatening injuries. I had broken my neck and my back in 6 places. I had broken 5 ribs on my left side. I had broken my right arm. I had broken my collarbone. I had broken some bones in my feet. My whole right side was ripped open and filled with gravel. My head was cut open across the front, lifted back, exposing the skull underneath. I had head injuries, I had internal injuries, and I had massive blood loss. In fact, I lost about 5 litres of blood, which is all someone my size would actually hold. By the time the helicopter arrived at Prince Henry Hospital in Sydney, my blood pressure was 40 over nothing. I was having a really bad day. I might be able to laugh now, but you can imagine what it was like for my parents, every parent's worst nightmare. I don't remember the accident because I had already left my body. And for 10 days, I drifted between 2 worlds, 2 dimensions. One part of me was in intensive care, in excruciating pain. And the other part was looking on from above as if it was happening to somebody else. I didn't want to go back to my body. Why would I want to go back to a body that was so broken? It was the fight of my life. But after 10 days, I made the decision to come back to my body, and the internal bleeding stopped. The next concern was whether I would walk again. I was paralysed from the waist down. They said my neck break was a stable fracture, but my back break, L1 in my back, was completely crushed, as if you'd trodden on a peanut, and the bone was lodged in my spinal cord. They said we're going to have to operate. I had an anterior decompression laminectomy. They literally cut me in half. They went in and they picked all the bone out of my spinal cord that had lodged in the cord. They took out 2 of my broken ribs. They put that in my back and they rebuilt my vertebra. They rebuilt my back. Then they spent an entire hour stitching me up. And when I woke up in intensive care with a big drain coming out of my side, draining blood, so much pain I couldn't breathe, the doctors were excited because at that point I had a tiny little bit of movement in one of my big toes. And I thought, great, because I'm going to the Olympics. I had no idea. I knew people broke their necks and backs and didn't walk again, but that's the sort of thing that happens to someone else, right? But the doctor came over to me and said, Janine, the operation was a success. We've picked as much bone as we could out of your spinal cord and we've made a solid fusion. But you see, they're central nervous system nerves and there is no cure. So even though we think that you might get some improvement, perhaps one day you might walk again with calipers on your legs and a walking frame, you will have all the injuries of paraplegia. I had no feeling from the waist down. She said at most I might get 10 or if I'm lucky 20%. I would have internal injuries for the rest of my life. I would have to use a catheter for the rest of my life. And then I remember very clearly her saying to me, Janine, you're going to have to rethink your life because you are never going to be able to do the things you did before. I was in my last year at university. I wanted to be an exercise physiologist. My life revolved around sport. I was an athlete. If I couldn't do that, then what would I do with my life? They moved me from intensive care to acute spinal, where I would spend the next 6 months of my life. Can you imagine, flat on your back? 6 months. I couldn't move my legs. They were in tight TED stockings to protect from blood clots. I had one arm in plaster, one arm tied down by drips. I had a neck brace around my neck and sandbags on either side of my head. And that's how I spent 6 months of my life. I spent that time in that ward with 5 other people that I normally wouldn't have mixed with because they weren't in my tribe. They weren't athletes like I was. I remember one night one of the nurses came into hospital and put big packs of plastic straws on top of all of us. And he said to us, start threading the straws together. There wasn't much else to do in the spinal ward, so we were pretty excited. We started threading our straws together until all the straws were joined up like this. And then he went around and he linked all of our straws up until there was one large ring of straws wrapping around the spinal ward. And then he said, right, everybody hold on. And we all held on. And he said, right, now we're all connected. And it was this incredible moment that 5 other people, 6 of us lying in the spinal ward, that couldn't see each other because we couldn't turn our heads. We just stared at the ceiling. We were connected. And even in the spinal ward, even paralysed, there were moments of incredible depth and richness, of authenticity and connection that I'd never experienced before. And we all knew that our lives would never be the same again, as we wondered what we would do when we left the spinal ward. When I left that ward 6 months later, it was a very different person from the one that came in. For a start, I was covered in a plaster body cast. I was in a wheelchair. And before I left, the head nurse said, Janine, I want you to be ready because when you get home, something's going to happen. And I said, what? She said, you're going to get depressed. And I said, not me, not Janine the machine, which was my nickname. She said, you are, because in hospital, you're like everyone else. Everyone's paralysed, everyone's in wheelchairs. That's normal. Just be prepared. And I thought, no way. And I went home with my wheelchair in the back of my father's car and I had no idea what was awaiting for me. Life had gone on for my friends and everybody else. I was home in a wheelchair. I weighed about 90 pounds. I had no feeling from the waist down. I couldn't walk. I was in a wheelchair attached to a catheter bottle. I had a body that didn't function properly. And I did get depressed. And I'm not talking about I'm having a bad day, but the sort of depression where you think, why did I ever come back to this body? And there were days when I didn't want to get out of bed and days when I didn't get out of bed. But I remembered that I had made a choice to come back to this body and I needed to know why. And so I decided that I would make another choice. And that was to accept not only my body, but the circumstances of my life. And I thought to myself, maybe rock bottom is actually the perfect place to start. Now, I had never been a creative person, I thought, before my accident. But now I was about to embark on the most creative project that any of us could ever do, that of rebuilding a life. I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do, but in that uncertainty came a sense of freedom because I was no longer tied to a fixed path, and that realization was about to change my life. Sitting outside in my wheelchair, an aeroplane flew over my house. And I looked up and I thought to myself, that's it. If I can't walk, then I might as well fly. I said, Mum, I'm going to learn how to fly. And she went, oh, that's nice, dear. Another cup of tea. It was crazy. But I knew it had to do. I said, pass me the yellow pages. And she did. And I looked up F for flying schools. And I rang the first one and inquired about something called a TIFF, a trial instructional flight. And it sounded pretty good. And weeks later, Mum bought me a pair of baggy overalls. And Mum and a friend drove me out to Bankstown Airport. And they carried me into the flying school. And they were holding me up like this. And I can tell you, I did not look like the ideal candidate to get a pilot's license. And they took one look and ran out the back to draw short straws. Who's going to get hurt? No, yay. They took me down, they drove me down, and on the tarmac was this red, white and blue aeroplane. I was so excited. They had to lift me up into the cockpit in my plaster cast. They sat me in the cockpit and I'm sitting there and there are buttons and dials everywhere. Wow, I was so excited. And Andrew, the instructor, he turned the aeroplane on. He said, would you like to have a go at taxiing? That's when you use your legs to control the rudder pedals on the ground. I said, no, I can't use my legs. And he went, oh. I went, but I can use my hands. And he went, okay. So he taxied over to the runway. He applied the power and we took off down the runway at Bankstown Airport. And as the wheels lifted up off the tarmac, I felt the most incredible sense of freedom. And as we flew over the training area, Andrew said to me, he pointed and he said, you see that mountain over there? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you just head towards that mountain. You take the controls and head towards that mountain. And I did. And I realized that I was flying towards the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, where my journey had begun. And Andrew said, try a couple of turns left and right. And I tried a little turn left and a little turn right. And, you know, my friend was in the back and Andrew said, no, try a couple of steeper turns and try steeper to the left and steeper to the right. And I looked in the back at my friend Chris and he was going, oh my God, nothing's stopping me. Andrew didn't let me land that day, which is probably just as well. He waved goodbye and thought he'd never see me again. But I had other plans. I went home, I got my training diary out, I ripped the last page and I did whatever I could. Mum used to help me lie on the ground in my plaster body cast. She would help me lie on the ground and I would lift my feet, my legs, just a few inches. It took every bit of my strength. And as long as I lifted them one more time than the day before, then that was enough to keep me going. And I practiced my walking as much as I could. And I went from the point of 2 people holding me up to 1 person holding me up to the point where I could walk around the furniture as long as it wasn't too far apart. And then I made great progression to the point where I could walk around the house holding onto the walls. And Mum said she was forever following me, wiping off my fingerprints. But she said at least she always knew where I was. And then something wonderful happened. I got my big plaster cast removed and they put a steel brace on, which they said I would have to wear for another 3 months. And I had my first shower in 7 months. And what a relief that was for Mum and Dad. Then I had to go for a medical. There aren't certain doctors that can test for for pilots' medicals, but I went along and I did whatever I could and eventually, amazingly, I passed. And I spent every moment I could out at that flying school. And there I was with all these young guys that wanted to be Qantas pilots, and then there was little old hop-along me with my steel brace and my baggy overalls and my bag of medication and catheters and everything else, and they looked at me and thought, who is she kidding? And sometimes I thought that too. I was so close to giving up, but I didn't, because there was something inside of me that far outweighed my injuries. And I went on and I learned to fly an aeroplane and got my private pilot's license. I then went on and learned to navigate and flew around Australia and got my unrestricted private pilot's license. And then I went on, there was no stopping me. I went on and I learned to fly an aeroplane with 2 engines. I got my twin engine. I went on and I learned to fly in bad weather and got my instrument rating. I then went on and I got my commercial pilot's license. I then went on and I got my instructor rating. And then I found myself back at that same school where I'd gone for that very first TIFF, teaching other people how to fly in less than 18 months after I'd left that spinal ward. And then I saw an aeroplane flying upside down and I thought, why not? And then I became an aerobatics flying instructor. And then I knew for certain that although my body was limited, it was my spirit that was unstoppable. I want to tell you that when I used to run on the hills, I had a technique. And my technique was this. I didn't look at the top. I looked down at the ground and I watched my feet, step by step, until eventually I was at the top of the hill. Francis of Assisi says it so simply. He says, just do what's necessary, then do what's possible. And before you know it, you're doing the impossible. The only thing I could do when I got home after my accident was to accept my situation. Acceptance is not resignation. Acceptance is empowering. Acceptance is saying, well, that's happened, that's the past, now what? And then all I had to do was just take the next step. And before I knew it, I was doing the impossible. I wasn't meant to live. I wasn't meant to walk. And I wasn't meant to fly. And even though I am still a walking paraplegic, I will continue to do the things that everybody thinks are impossible. The doctor said I would never have children, and guess what? I've got 3. So I now know that there is no problem too difficult that it can't be solved, or any hill too steep that it can't be climbed. And the only thing that life requires from us is to be completely and fully in this moment right here where you are, in this chair, in this room, because there is no other moment. This is it. So I have 3 questions to leave you with today, and they're this. What hill are you facing in your life today? Secondly, can you jump out of your comfort zone and embrace uncertainty? And thirdly, can you learn to love it? Because when you can love it, then there are no hills, only infinite possibilities. Thank you.